On December 18, 1981, at the airfield of the Flight Research Institute in Zhukovsky, near Moscow, an aircraft that was not supposed to exist took to the air for the first time. A machine 54 meters long, with a wingspan of 55 meters and a center section entirely welded from titanium, accelerated to a speed that no other bomber in human history could achieve. Furthermore, the first flight happened on the personal initiative of test pilot Boris Veremey. The mission was originally intended only as a high-speed taxi run along the runway, but he decided to take the machine into the air and was right to do so. When American intelligence received satellite images of the new Soviet aircraft, real panic began in the Pentagon. Analysts could not believe that the Soviet Union had managed to create something like this, because this machine surpassed their own B-1B strategic bomber, on which the states had spent billions of dollars in key parameters. The aircraft was named the Tu-160, and over the following decades, it would become the most expensive, fastest, and most formidable winged weapon on the planet. It all began with the Americans themselves provoking the race. In the late 60s, the states launched a program to create a new generation strategic bomber capable of penetrating Soviet air defenses at supersonic speeds and extremely low altitudes. Moscow responded by announcing a competition among design bureaus. Three giants of Soviet aircraft construction entered the struggle. The Sukhoi Design Bureau, with a futuristic project based on a flying wing scheme. The Myasishchev Design Bureau with the M-18 project, which featured a variable sweep wing. And the Tupolev Design Bureau, which joined the competition slightly later than the others. In 1972, a commission headed by the commander of long-range aviation reviewed all three projects. The Myasishchev project won the formal victory. However, his design bureau had neither a production base nor experience in creating supersonic machines. Therefore, the country's leadership made a paradoxical decision. All the developments for the M-18 were transferred to the Tupolev Design Bureau, which by that time already had experience in creating the supersonic Tu-144 passenger plane and the Tu-22M bomber. Thus, the winners of the competition became assistants to those who were tasked with bringing the project to fruition. Valentin Bliznyuk was appointed chief designer. His approach was daring even by Soviet standards. Taking the Myasishchev concept with variable wing geometry as a basis, the Tupolev team redesigned the project practically from scratch. Over 800 enterprises across the Union collaborated on the creation of the machine. The main engineering audacity was the center section, the primary structural power element to which the wings, engines, and fuselage are attached. It was an all-welded titanium unit more than 12 meters long. It was precisely this that turned the Tu-160 into the most expensive combat aircraft in the entire history of the Soviet Union. One unit cost the Treasury approximately $250 million, and that was without the cost of armament. When the machine was shown to Western observers, they spoke of the Russians copying the American B-1B. The accusations did not arise from nowhere. The Soviet Union had not shied away from borrowing others' ideas in the past. The Tu-4 bomber of 1947 was practically an exact copy of the American Boeing B-29. The Gaz Akar of 1932 repeated the Ford, and the Moskvich suspiciously resembled the German Opel Kadett. But with the Tu-160, the situation was more complex. The aerodynamic scheme is indeed similar, but the internal components turned out to be completely different. 4 NK-32 engines were installed on the machine, each producing 25,000 kilograms of force in afterburner. The total power of the propulsion system allowed the massive machine, with a maximum takeoff weight of 275 tons, to accelerate to 2,200 kilometers per hour, which was significantly faster than its American competitor. But speed was only part of the superiority. The maximum flight range of the Tu-160 without refueling was about 14,000 kilometers. For comparison, The range of the American B-1B barely reached 12,000. The Soviet machine covered the distance from the Urals to the Atlantic, and each such aircraft carried 12 X-55 cruise missiles on drum launchers in 2 internal bomb bays. Each missile could carry a nuclear warhead, and its launch range reached 4,500 kilometers. One sortie by a single Tu-160 could theoretically erase a dozen major cities from the map. It was for this reason that the machine was secretly nicknamed the Continent Eraser. Despite its giant power, the aircraft turned out to be surprisingly obedient in handling. Unlike other heavy bombers that had a classic yoke, the Tu-160 was equipped with a small control stick, similar to a fighter jet joystick. When designers offered the pilots to replace it with a familiar yoke, they categorically refused. Pilots said that this giant could be controlled with one finger, so precise and responsive was the control system. One of the pilots, who had previously flown several types of strategic bombers, described the difference simply. It is like switching from a Zhiguli to a Mercedes. From the outside, the Tu-160 looked like a flying skyscraper, but as soon as you climbed inside, the illusion of grandeur instantly shattered. The crew of 4, 2 pilots, a navigator, and a weapons operator, was accommodated in a cramped cockpit where a large man could barely squeeze sideways through the narrow passage to his seat. From the outside, it seemed that the interior of this giant should be as spacious as a passenger liner, but the reality was quite different. Every centimeter of space was taken up by equipment. Instrument panels with hundreds of buttons and switches covered the walls from floor to ceiling, and the pilot seats stood so close together that the commander and the right pilot almost touched shoulders. The view from the cockpit was also unimpressive. The windshield was so small that the pilot literally had to stand up in his seat just to see anything ahead. To solve this problem, the designers made the seat movable. Before flight, it moved forward and up, and the pedals could be adjusted to the length of the legs. In the working position, the pilot was pressed against the instrument panel, and the view became acceptable, though still far from ideal. However, for a strategic bomber that spent most of the flight on autopilot, this was not considered a critical flaw. A separate story was that very control stick. Millimeter movements were all that was required for maneuvering. The aircraft reacted instantly to the slightest deviation, and in this lay a particular difficulty. The pilot had to develop the skill to hold his hand absolutely still for hours on end, because the designers had provided no rest or support for the wrist. The hand simply hung in the air, and any involuntary movement from fatigue could affect the machine's behavior. Some pilots later admitted that this was the only serious inconvenience in the entire aircraft, but one could only get used to it through long months of training. After takeoff and gaining altitude, the crew turned on the autopilot, and then the machine guided itself. But the rule was ironclad. If one pilot left his seat, the second was obliged to remain in place and monitor the instruments. The aircraft was not left unattended for a second, yet leaving the seat was necessary for a very prosaic reason. There was a toilet on board. More precisely, it formerly existed, but it was used very reluctantly. The path to it lay through a service hatch in the floor, and many pilots seriously feared that this hatch might not hold, and they would fall straight into the sky from an altitude of 10,000 meters. The fear was irrational. The construction was reliable, but when there are 10 kilometers of emptiness beneath you, rational arguments work poorly. Therefore, some crew members preferred to endure for 12 hours straight just to avoid going through that hatch. On the other hand, when transitioning to supersonic speed, the machine behaved surprisingly delicately. When Western journalists asked pilots about G-forces at a speed of 2,000 kilometers per hour, they were sincerely surprised by the question. The transition through the sound barrier in the Tu-160 cockpit was practically unfelt. No crushing G-forces, no facial deformations like those of fighter pilots on a centrifuge. The allowable G load for the strategic bomber was only 2G, and this was enough to perform all intended maneuvers. Pilots said that at 2,000 kilometers per hour, you feel nothing at all. The machine just flies smoothly and confidently, as if speed has nothing to do with it. But behind this outward calm lay a monstrous gluttony. At supersonic speeds, the four engines devoured tens of tons of kerosene per hour. A full fuel load was about 148 tons of fuel, and in intensive flight mode, these reserves melted at a frightening rate. A single refueling cost an astronomical sum, and even in peacetime, by no means could every flight be performed on a full tank. Later, after the collapse of the Union, this would become one of the main problems. Pilots would simply have nothing to fly because kerosene for the Tu-160 cost more than the new independent states could afford. Besides fuel, the machine required colossal technical maintenance. Each sortie was supported by a whole army of ground personnel, engineers, technicians, armorers, and specialists in radio-electronic equipment. Preparing one aircraft for a combat sortie took hours of painstaking work. This made the Tu-160 not just a weapon, but an entire system that could only function with powerful state support. As long as the Soviet Union stood behind it with its military budget and industrial base, this was not a problem. But in December 1991, the Union ceased to exist, and 19 titanium monsters, together with their crews, found themselves on the territory of independent Ukraine. This is where the story began that makes any military pilot's heart ache. In April 1992, at the airbase in Poltava, an event occurred that could have forever changed the balance of power in the post-Soviet space, but about which almost no one found out. One of the officers of the regiment, who held the position of deputy commander for flight training, returned from the Moscow region, where he had participated in a demonstration of the Tu-160 to the president of Russia. While he was away, strange activity began at the airfield. The acting commander of the regiment prepared a flight schedule for 11 aircraft that were supposedly to perform a flight to a tactical launch zone. But the deputy commander immediately noticed several details that did not fit with a typical training sortie. First, the route lay through the Sumy region straight into Russian airspace. Second, instead of the standard 17 tons of kerosene, each aircraft was to receive nearly 50 tons. Refueling that made no sense for a short flight to the nearest zone. The plan was obvious. 12 bombers were to take to the air, cross the border, and land at the Russian airbase Engels, from where they were never destined to return. The officer refused to sign the flight schedule. Without his signature, the flights were impossible according to regulations, but the acting regiment commander Zakharev, who would subsequently make a brilliant career in the Russian Air Force and become the commander of Russian long-range aviation, found a way to bypass the ban and sign the documents himself. Then the deputy commander called the actual regiment commander, Valery Gorgol, who was on vacation at the time. Gorgol immediately rushed to the base and canceled the sorties. The hijacking attempt failed. Shortly before this, 7 Su-24 frontline bombers had already managed to be transferred from Ukrainian territory to Russia. It was after this incident that the Ukrainian leadership banned any flights of the Tu-160 outside the country. Meanwhile, in March of that same year, 92, a large-scale display of military equipment for the presidents of the Commonwealth of Independent States was taking place in Belarusian Machulishchi. Among other weapon samples on the airfield stood a Tu-160. Boris Yeltsin personally approached the machine, shook hands with the crew, and, struck by the beauty and power of the aircraft, uttered a phrase that would forever be attached to this bomber: White Swan. Thus, with a casual remark from the Russian president, the popular nickname was born, which subsequently became almost official. It is curious that the fate of another extraordinary person was connected with this aircraft. In Poltava, at one time, Djokhar Dudayev, the future president of the Chechen Republic, served as chief of staff of a heavy bomber aviation division. This was remarkable in itself, because in Soviet times, Chechens were extremely reluctantly admitted into aviation, and even more so to positions of such a level. Young pilots of the regiment flew in the same crew with Dudayev and remembered him as a stern but fair commander who demanded strict compliance with instructions and regulations. One of the pilots, then a very young Wright pilot just out of flight school, performed a flight with him to the Shaykovka airfield for official business. According to him, Dudayev was a healthy man in the prime of his life, a colonel and an entire division chief. And sitting next to him was a graduate who only had to silently do his job and not interfere with his superior. In April 1996, Dudayev would die from a strike by a guided missile homing in on the signal of his satellite phone. While political passions boiled around the planes, the pilots continued to serve and fly, although conditions became harder with each passing year. Pay was delayed for months, from half a year to 11 months, and people had to survive literally on what they could find, feeding families without receiving a kopeck from the state. Fuel for flights was practically not allocated, and commanders invented inconceivable schemes to maintain the flight training of the crews. Entrepreneurial people were found who wanted to fly on the legendary bomber, and agreements were made with them simply, "Bring a tank of kerosene, and we will give you a ride." While the guest enjoyed the flight, the crew simultaneously worked on training tasks and maintained flight skills. The flight was recorded in red ink in the guest's flight log, and he would later proudly tell how he had mastered the Tu-160. It sounds like a joke, but in those years it was the only way to maintain the regiment's combat readiness because the state had no use for its aviation. In 2003, an incident broke out that showed that strategic aviation could still serve as a real deterrent. Russia tried to annex the Ukrainian island of Tuzla in the Kerch Strait, acting boldly and provocatively. A battle alarm was sounded at the airbase. Real missiles were loaded onto the planes, and the crews were ready for takeoff. The provocation retreated for 11 years, and some military personnel later directly linked this to the fact that at that time, Ukraine still had aviation capable of delivering a serious blow. In 1999, two prime ministers met in Moscow, Vladimir Putin and Valery Pustovoitenko. On the table lay a document that determined the fate of 8 Tu-160 strategic bombers, 3 Tu-95 units, and nearly 600 X-55 cruise missiles, each capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. Ukraine was giving all this wealth to Russia not for cash, but to settle gas debts. The amount of the deal was $275 million, which, according to military specialists' calculations, barely covered the cost of half of a single Tu-160. The decision was made exclusively by the Cabinet of Ministers. The issue was not even brought before the Verkhovna Rada for consideration, and Parliament learned of what had happened only after the fact. It is noteworthy what happened immediately after the signing of this deal. Putin and Pustovoitenko went together to a football match of the qualifying tournament for the European Championship 2000, Russia against Ukraine. To advance to the next round, the Ukrainian team needed at least a draw. The team conceded first, but in the final minutes, Andriy Shevchenko scored a goal that goalkeeper Filimonov curiously fumbled into his own net. The whole country celebrated the victory, and did not suspect that the main events were unfolding not on the football field, but in offices a few days earlier, where with a stroke of a pen, they gave away the strategic weapons capable of holding a whole continent in check. One of the authors of the idea to exchange bombers for gas was named Igor Bakai, then head of Naftogaz, a man whom the thought of high treason did not bother in the least. After the Orange Revolution, Bakai ended up on the international wanted list for 7 criminal cases for abuse of power and, by a surprising coincidence, in 2005 acquired Russian citizenship. In 2010, after Yanukovych came to power, the Pechersk court, the name of which by then already sounded like a meme, successfully closed all criminal cases. Even in Russia, Bakai was later arrested twice, but both times he got off with suspended sentences. Pusto Voitenko himself, after leaving the post of prime minister, never commented on the sale of the planes and carefully avoided journalists asking uncomfortable questions. He managed to work as an advisor to Yanukovych, receive several state awards, and at the same time publicly state that Ukraine needed to be friends with Russia and that it was not needed by anyone in Europe. Repentance did not come then, nor later. Meanwhile, the machines that did not go to Russia faced an even more bitter fate. Within the framework of the American Program for Assistance in the Destruction of Strategic Weapons, the states funded the utilization of the remaining bombers. The procedure was structured with surgical precision and absolute ruthlessness. The aircraft was cut into 3 parts, separating the wings from the fuselage, after which the fragments were dragged several meters away from each other. In this form, the remains had to stand for 3 days, exactly the amount of time required for an American reconnaissance satellite to take pictures and record that the machine was indeed destroyed and could not be reassembled. Only after confirmation from space were the fragments sent for smelting. Pilots, who had given the best years of their lives to these planes, could not bear to watch. One of the regiment commanders, present during the dismantling of the first aircraft, burst into tears right on the airfield, turned around, and said that his foot would never be there again. In Pryluki, at another air base, servicemen tried to organize rallies and prevent the cutting of the machines, but an order is an order. The most horrific part was the destruction of an absolutely new aircraft that had come from the factory, made only 3 landings, and had a total flight time of 20 hours. Effectively, the machine was bought, transferred to the airfield, and immediately sent under the knife without being given a single chance to serve its purpose. This was equivalent to buying a new car, driving 2 kilometers, and turning it into scrap metal. On August 28, 2003, a Tu-160 rose into the sky over Ukraine for the last time. After this flight, no one ever flew this type of aircraft in the country again. The pilot who performed this final flight later said that he retired at 44 because if the orchestra does not need him, why does he need the orchestra? But the longing for the sky did not let him go for a single day. 3 regiment commanders who served in different years had by then already died, never having survived the collapse of their life's work. The Americans were given a cut-off piece of the nose section of the last destroyed Tu-22M3 as a souvenir, a fragment of an aircraft that once struck terror into enemy naval groups in the world ocean. The bombers were only the tip of the iceberg. After the collapse of the Union, Ukraine inherited the second most powerful army in Europe. Nearly 1 million servicemen, 1,800 combat aircraft, thousands of tanks, and colossal stockpiles of armaments. All this was rapidly turning into a commodity sold left and right, sometimes openly, but more often through murky schemes involving people whom the press delicately called arms barons. In 2002, a scandal broke out that crushed Ukraine's international reputation. Former presidential security major Mykola Melnichenko, already known to the world through secret recordings of Kuchma's conversations in the so-called cassette scandal, gave testimony that his tapes recorded a conversation between President Kuchma and the head of the Ukrsspets export company, Valery Malev. The talk was about the possible sale to Iraq of the Kolchuga passive electronic monitoring station, a unique Ukrainian development capable of detecting even American stealth aircraft in the air. Iraq at that moment was under strict international sanctions. Only a year remained before the invasion by the American coalition, and the mere thought of selling such equipment there was equivalent to a slap in the face to Washington. The United States reacted instantly. $54 million of government aid to Ukraine were frozen, and most Western leaders refused to do business with Kuchma. The president held press conferences, called the accusations nonsense, and denied everything. No, the most interesting thing happened to that same Malev, who was called the main seller of Ukrainian weapons in the press. In the middle of the scandal, he died in a car crash in the Poltava region. His Audi crashed into a Kamaz. 3 years earlier, under suspiciously similar circumstances, another arms baron, Boris Marusich, had died in a similar road accident. The New York Times published an article listing a whole series of such fatal accidents among high-ranking Ukrainian officials, hinting that all the deceased shared one common trait. They were inconvenient for Kuchma and his inner circle. The Kolchuga stations were never found in Iraq, and there is a version that the entire scandal was provoked by Moscow, because as a result, Kuchma lost Western allies and was forced to turn toward Russia. And in 2004, he personally crossed out the point from Ukraine's military doctrine, stating that joining NATO was the ultimate goal of the policy of Euro-Atlantic integration. Presidents changed, but scandals did not stop. In 2008, Somali pirates captured the Ukrainian ship Faina off the coast of Africa, on board of which were 33 T-72 tanks and Grad multiple launch rocket systems. The Ukrainian side claimed that the cargo was intended for Kenya and even presented contracts. But the United States made public real agreements and satellite images on which it was clearly visible how the tanks were being transported in transit through Kenyan territory to South Sudan, which was then on the American list of state sponsors of terrorism. Denial became pointless, and the scandal turned into an international embarrassment. All this time, the strategic aviation that could have been the country's real shield was being methodically destroyed. Pilots who went through these years later said the same thing with bitterness. If Ukraine had kept even the Poltava bomber regiment and a stock of missiles, the Russian Black Sea Fleet would never have left Sevastopol. The launch range of Tu-22 M3 anti-ship missiles was 370 kilometers. And to strike ships in the bay, it was not even necessary to enter the enemy's air defense engagement zone. No, these planes were also cut up, and the newest units that had just come from the factory were destroyed first, rather than the old machines with exhausted service lives. The same ones that are still flying in Russia today, and those 8 Tu-160 units that Russia received for gas debts are now guarded as the apple of its eye. Unlike the Tu-95 units, which take to the air regularly and carry up to 8 missiles on external pylons, the White Swans are used extremely rarely. The reason is simple: there are few of them. Training flight crews for this machine takes years, and each aircraft is worth its weight in gold. At the same time, one Tu-160 is capable of carrying 12 cruise missiles in internal bomb bays, which is 1.5 times more than the Tu-95. Russia simply saves them, keeping them in reserve for the most extreme case. If you like this story, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss future episodes. And in the comments, write how you think. Could strategic aviation have actually changed the course of events? Or were all these planes doomed from the moment the Soviet Union ceased to exist?